It's the Brad and John Show.
It is the Brad and John Show. I am Brad. He is John. Today's date is February 19th. It's a very cold, snowy morning, and the Post-Dispatch is on your front doorstep by now. I mean, they don't just throw it on your lawn. It's on the doorstep. They actually get out at each home and walk up there and put it on that doorstep. So you'll know how deep the snow is because you'll look out on your front lawn and you'll see how deep those snow prints are from the footprints from the guy coming up to putting it on your doorstep. Right, John?
Remember when they used to have those bright yellow wrappers?
Yeah.
And that's how you would be able to spot them in the snow? Oh, that reminds me of childhood.
Okay. Little inside baseball. Yesterday I teased about this. I had lunch with John Beck. John Beck is one of these guys that I have a tremendous amount of respect for. John Beck came to St. Louis in 1984. He's originally from Pittsburgh, and his media career moved him around the country. I think he was in Kansas City for a while. He came here to St. Louis, and he was poised with the problem of reviving a once powerful radio station with the call letters of KSHE. And when I met John Beck, they were still down in their building. Did you ever remember seeing that building? They were in that little like concrete block building there on Watson next to the drive-in theater. You know what I'm talking about?
No, I don't know. I'm not familiar with that.
The transmitter was out back. Literally, there was a tower out back. The transmitter was right there. And very, very, very small building. Matter of fact, terribly small. The people who worked there complained. There were like 20 people crammed into. I think, if I'm not mistaken, the building was about 900 square feet. And that was the studios and, the air studio or production studio, offices, sales offices, and the whole bit. Okay. John took KSHE and changed it from he hired JC. And it's funny, he says he still talks to JC quite often. Hired JC
Corcoran, right?
JC Corcoran, put that station on overdrive. And at one point in time, it was bucking up against KMOX in the ratings. And he reinvented it with the classic commercial. I don't know if you remember this. It was a well-done commercial where a guy, it's like a husband and wife, and the guy grabs a guitar and starts doing air guitar. And the whole theme of the commercial was, you're never too old to rock and roll, okay? And they would play like, Led Zeppelin music or Rolling Stones music. Okay. He went from there to run Emmis. Essentially, Emmis bought KSHE, and then when Emmis got out of the radio business, John went into business for himself, and then he got called back into the radio business to run iHeart, which is the 7-station cluster here, including the Bull and KLOU and stations like that. Well, he just finished his 4-year contract, and he's now on his own, and he's essentially working as a lobbyist, but not too much in Jefferson City, but a lot in D.C., and it's really interesting because him and I had, I don't see John that much. I haven't seen him probably in 3 or 4 years. And quite honestly, he's not the guy that I hang with all the time. And I think I told you this story. I've been bugging him to have a meeting with him. And I've been calling him for like a month and a half. And he never would call me back. So finally last week, I call him and I say, John, this is Brad Hildebrand. Do not call me back. I don't want to hear from you. Don't call me back. Here's my phone number. And he called me like in 5 minutes. Okay. We had an incredible lunch yesterday. And what's so interesting about this is he's older than I, so he's like really old, okay? And the interesting part of this is he says the same thing I do. We're fighting a battle that nobody quite understands because of the fact that, once again, he said it, 91% of the adult population listens to radio at least once a week. But you got guys like John who will say, well, the radio business and the newspaper business are the same thing. They're outdated antiquities, right? Isn't it stuff you say? But yet, here you are on the radio.
Verbatim. Go ahead. Let's get to your point. Yeah.
Well, no, it was just interesting. And what he's doing is, and I thought this was fascinating, he's doing lobbying for the Missouri Broadcasters Association. And a bunch of broadcasters, a bunch of state broadcasters around the country are going to the Capitol. And this is the point I'm trying to make on this, and I know it sounds like I'm rambling on this. And he says they meet with legislators, they meet with regulators and stuff like that. And I said, have you done this before? Oh, yeah, many times. I said, does it work? And he smiles. He says, yes, it does. And I'm thinking, isn't that interesting? Because of the fact that John Combest is the guy who's making fun of meeting people face to face when...
Yeah, absolutely not. Because that's what you do when you're lobbying people. Brad, what are the issues that they're lobbying for?
Quite a bit of different things. A thing that's still probably huge on the national scene is the AM radio thing. And once again, here I go again. I got to get rid of that crutch. The crazy thing on this is that the car manufacturers are not against AM radio. And the reason that they have a problem is, and this is sort of technical nerd stuff, but Section 15, of the Communications Act requires that devices not emit harmful interference, okay? Every stinking electric car is like a super, if it were pollution, these would be like North County, this would be like Coldwater Creek, okay? Because they emit all this electronic hash, and especially the electric cars with the electric motors and stuff like that transmit all this garbage into the airwaves, okay? And the reason the real reason the car manufacturers don't want AM radio in the car anymore, because they can't make it work right. They'd have to either do one of two things: either come up with some incredible shielding devices to shield the radio from all these harmful emissions, radio emissions that their car is emitting, or they would have to clean up their dirty cars. Now, the problem with this is they're not going to do it. So what do they say? Nobody listens to AM radio, we're going to take it out. Now, the crazy part of this is when Ford decided to reverse course, Ford, on a lot of their new cars, eliminated AM radio. And they got to what's his face's cousin who runs Ford. You know what I'm talking about?
Chris Farley's cousin.
Chris Farley's cousin who runs Ford, and he essentially said, you know what? We're going to reverse course. We're going to put AM radio back in. And you know how they did it?
How?
They dropped a small little line of code into the cars, and bang, all the AM radio started to work. They never took it out. They just disabled it. It was in the radio already, but they firmware disabled it. So they just essentially firmware re-enabled it. Okay? It's because they can't make it work right. And what's sad about that is just tell the truth. That's one of the things there. That's a big thing with National Association Broadcasters. They were hoping that was going to be, there's a thing where, and the thing that's sort of sad about this is, and I'll give you a little inside baseball stuff. I don't know all the workings of the Senate. It gets very complicated, but there was a point.
You mean the U.S. Senate?
The U.S. Senate, yes. And I can't remember what this is called. When I heard it, I thought, I've never heard that before, because I read this bill, this information talking about this radio bill. And there's a point where something can be taken to the Senate, and they can essentially say, okay, we're not going to put this to a vote, but does anybody have an objection to it? And if nobody objects to it, then it gets sort of fast-tracked into the calendar. Get what I'm saying?
Unanimous consent. You're talking about unanimous consent.
I guess, is that what it is?
Yeah. I mean, that's the concept. Yeah, unanimous consent. That means that nobody opposes it.
Okay, one guy out of the 100 senators, one guy opposed it. Guess who that was?
Josh Hawley.
Rand Paul.
Oh, yeah, because why should the government be forcing anything, right?
Right. And his philosophy was, why? As a matter of fact, there's a famous quote, there's a famous snippet that's on, if you're a radio geek, and even if you're a political geek, where he was on a radio station. He was on a talk show in his home state. I think he was on Louisville. I think it might have been WHAS. He was on with the morning guy, and he essentially says, I think that bill sucks. He didn't say that in so many words, but he intimated that. And he says, you Republicans are always looking for, he says, you conservative Republicans, and I thought he was a conservative Republican, but he made the comment, you conservative Republicans are always looking for less government intervention. Now you want more government intervention. That's why I shot it down. I'm thinking to myself, that sucks. Because of the fact that, and the crazy part of this is, the thing that makes no sense about this is that the federal government has invested hundreds of millions, maybe even into the 10-figure billion figure of making AM radio the de facto standard for emergency alert and emergency communications. And the reason I say that is, I don't care what these cell companies say. If the stuff hits, or Shelley would say, what, the defecation hits the rotary oscillator, was that her favorite term?
Yeah, that was.
If the defecation hits the rotary oscillator, your cell phone will be a brick, because none of the cell sites will work. They'll all go down. Trust me, I know. I got a cell site, and when the electricity goes out, they run on batteries, but the batteries only run so long, and if the cell site doesn't have an emergency generator, the cell site goes dark. And not only that, the cell sites are all connected for the most part by internet, by fiber optic, by high-speed internet lines, whatever you want to call it. And if you have the internet go down. And remember what happened. This is sort of nerd kind of stuff. Remember this bizarre, weird story that happened in Nashville, been about 3, 4, 5 years ago. Remember this story? Remember on Christmas?
No, I don't. I don't remember it.
This bizarre nutbag drove a van in front of an AT&T office in Nashville and blew it up and knocked out phone service in the entire Nashville metro area, landline and cell phone service for like a week, because one point of contact, all the cell phones and all the main switching went through this one office in Nashville, and I don't even remember if they ever came up with why the guy did it, but one guy, a suicide bomber who blew up this van he had filled with explosives, knocked out communications to a metro area for like a week. But guess what was still on the air, John? Guess what was still on the air? AM radio and the FM radios were still on the air. And I've been lucky enough to see this. My old buddy Joe Geerling, who was the former chief engineer at Odyssey and KMOX, I saw the KMOX transmitter site about 4 or 5 years ago, and it was like, the nerd in me really came out. But he points to me, and it's in a big open field in the middle of nowhere in Madison County. It's south of 162 between 157 and 111 over in Illinois. And they've got, I don't know how many acres, great big monstrous place. And he pointed out that there's this building and this compound next to their transmitter building. And he says, that's the FEMA site. I go, what do you mean that's the FEMA site? He says, they have a complete duplicate set of equipment that we have. They have a complete another 1120 transmitter, but it's all EMP proof.
And you took a tour of it, right? Didn't he give you a tour of it?
No, you can't go in it. You can't go in it.
Oh, I remember the story. I thought he gave you a tour of it.
No, you can't go in it because it's federal. It's protected. It's got big warning signs, the whole bit. And if the stuff hits the fan, once again, if the defecation hits the rotary oscillator, there is someone assigned to each, or matter of fact, multiple people that are assigned to each one of these sites across the country that go to these sites and turn on their transmitter, because the KMOX transmitter would probably be destroyed by the EMP, and they turn on the transmitter, and this is the primary way of getting emergency communications out through the United States. The chain of AM radio stations that they've set up as FEMA, I guess what you call it, FEMA emergency management stations, whatever they call it. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, so if you get rid of AM radio in cars, what good is that? You know what I'm saying?
And so is the notion, if we play this out, there's a giant disaster like there was in Nashville, let's say. And then if people can't get cell communication, they're going to go to their car, they'll start their car, they'll turn on AM radio, and they'll be able to hear, hey, here's the status of the disaster.
Well, see, interesting you bring that up, because, it's sort of like Wizard of Oz. Once you've looked behind the curtain, you think that, and they talk about, you don't hear this as much as you heard it. The term hardened, Hardened. Okay, hardened. What does that term mean to you? And be nice, John. Come on now.
In whatever context that you're talking about, I have no idea.
Okay, if you harden something, you make it impregnable. And here we go again. John's going to throw something at that. You make it to the point where you make it very difficult for it to fail. They talk about, a bank will harden its safe. Like for example, years ago, I was taken on a tour. Mercy Healthcare Systems has their entire data processing system, for every hospital in their chain all over the country, in a hardened building outside of Washington, Missouri. And to the point where we were invited for a tour before the building was up, the equipment wasn't in, and it has an outside wall of the building and has no windows, outside wall of the building, which will withstand winds of up to 130 miles an hour. Then there's a dead space, and then there's an inner wall that will take winds up to like 150 miles an hour. The building has two huge monstrous generators with like 10-day tanks where the things will run for 10 days. They have different fiber systems coming into the facility from different angles. One angle of the building comes in with AT&T fiber. Another angle of the building comes in with Verizon. Okay, it's hardened to the point where it would take really a huge catastrophe for that building to go down, and the Mercy the EMR system, the emergency computer system, to go offline. That's what the hardening's all about. And the problem is the cellular system is incredibly vulnerable. And why do you think that the federal government, one of the things that Joe Biden did was, what he did right was when he would not allow Huawei equipment into the United States. If you know the whole story, Huawei is this big monstrous Chinese conglomerate that makes all this very sophisticated equipment, and they make cell phone equipment because they're the experts were saying, yeah, that Huawei stuff's got all sorts of back doors in it where the Chinese can come in and monitor all our cell activity. And especially, think about this, if you've got Huawei cell phone equipment in Washington, D.C., and all the senators are sitting there with their iPhones and their Androids, you know everything that's going on in D.C., right?
Yeah, which would be depressing, I think, for the Chinese, right?
Yes.
And then you'd also see what videos they watch on their TikTok, which would be even more depressing.
Right.
So what you're saying, Brad, is the government should tell car manufacturers that they must have AM radio in cars.
Well, there are certain things that I think are necessary for the greater good. And yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. And the point being is, if you've ever taken one of these disaster courses, and you know, people talk about this, oh, this is never going to happen, never going to happen, never going to happen. You never know. And if you've ever taken, I mean, talk to people in Joplin. I have friends that live in Joplin, okay? My son went down there and worked in Joplin after he worked for a company that essentially was working on rebuilding the buildings down there. I mean, there was to the point where when you have a massive calamity like it happened in Joplin, people didn't know where they were because of the fact that they didn't have any landmarks. That you went down the street and there's a Quick Trip on your left and you make a left there and you go down 3 blocks and there's a McDonald's, you turn right. It's all gone. So all of a sudden,
it's pretty much how you feel every day of like driving somewhere and then you forget where you're going, right?
It's how I feel after
the entire Joplin had turned into, first of all, your friends in Joplin don't know much because they didn't even know Chris Wright last year. You know, one of the top 30 candidates for Missouri governor.
Top 30 candidates.
Yeah, Brad, why don't we force car manufacturers? I think people your age, people that are pushing 90, I think every car should have to include a life alert. I think it should have to include like a voice notes thing so that people remember what they're going to pick up from Schnucks, what type of soda and fatty high glycemic food they're going to pick up after the show's off the air from Schnucks. I think government should mandate all these things. You know, it's for the greater good, Brad. This message has been brought to us by the people at the AM lobby who want you to run free ads on your station that say AM radio is critical to whatever. Guess what? People in their 90s still listen to it.
That coming from a guy who wants to pass a law that women have to wear at least 4-inch heels all day long.
That's right. And keep them on, Brad. Keep them on.
That's John's line of regulation right there, right? Okay. We have a good time, don't we, John?
Brad, I just fell, but there's no life alert here in this car, so I don't know what I'm going to do. Maybe I could turn on my AM radio, and they'll tell me what to do.
You know, here's the interesting thing. You were showing your ageism. Is that a word? Ageist?
Yes, thank you. I'm very ageist. Thank you.
You're showing your ageist. And one of these days, when the stuff hits the fan and John has no food and his cell phone don't work, he'll come over to my place and say, Brad, what's going on? I can't get on Twitter. I can't get on Instagram. And I go, John, I'm listening to KMOX right now. What do you need to know? Right?
And I'll say you're right.